Hey guys, today we're going to cover Chapter 13, Section 2 here, Bleeding Kansas and Dred Scott v. Sanford. We're only going to cover one key concept, that's 522B. The courts and national leaders made a variety of attempts to resolve the issue of slavery into territories, including the Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, both of which we covered the other day, or we're going to pick up today, and the Dred Scott decision, which we'll talk about here shortly. But all of these attempts ultimately failed to reduce the conflict. So let's pick right up with Bleeding Kansas, right after the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So what happened is no one was sure how Kansas-Nebraska would vote on the issue of slavery, but both sides wanted to control the outcome. So partisans on both sides of the slavery issue, those that opposed slavery, those who supported slavery, poured into Kansas. The first elections returned pro-slavery majorities, but the problem was they were marred by cheating, fraudulent vote counting, and voter intimidation. So no one really knew what the true outcome would have been with all that going on. So the results were challenged. And at this point, many more anti-slavery voters began arriving, and at that point outnumbered the pro-slavery advocates. Knowing this, the anti-slavery advocates hold their own elections, established their own state legislatures, adopted a state constitution, and elected their own governor. So at this point, Kansas has two legislatures from the initial vote, which turned out pro-slavery, and then the new anti-slavery one, two governors, and sent two territory representatives to Congress. As a result, Franklin Pierce decides to disperse the Topeka legislature, which was the second state legislature after the initial fraudulent vote, and appoints a new federal governor named Robert Walker, who's going to promise to hold an honest election. The Free State faction won the majority in these new fair elections, but at this point, the slave state legislature from the initial elections already appointed a constitutional convention to draft a state constitution. What they drafted was called the Lecompton Constitution, and it essentially legalized slavery in Kansas. Now remember, this new fair election turned out anti-slavery, so this initial state constitution was pro-slavery. So Congress is going to call for a vote on the Lecompton Constitution. And Kansas residents, now who majority are anti-slavery, are going to overwhelmingly defeat the proposed constitution, which essentially delays Kansas statehood until 1861. So that was Bleeding Kansas. And of course, as they showed the picture of John Brown, there was a lot of violence at that time in Kansas as well, hence the name Bleeding Kansas. All right, moving on to Dred Scott versus Sanford. A little bit about it. In an attempt to gain his freedom, a Missouri slave named Dred Scott sued for his freedom on the basis that he lived in a free territory. Basically what happened is Scott's central claim, he belonged to a surgeon in the military who took him to Illinois and then on to Fort Snelling in Minnesota. So Scott had lived in a free territory for several years now. And his argument was, by living in this free territory, he should have his freedom. So after a series of appeals, the U.S. Supreme Court is going to ultimately deny Scott his freedom based on the notion that blacks had no rights and that blacks had no rights that white men were bound to respect, and that as property of slaveholders, slaves were still under the subjection of their masters. So the Chief Justice at the time, Roger Taney, is going to make two key points. And as I said, first, as a black man, Scott had no rights that the U.S. needed to honor. Based on his reading of the Constitution, Chief Justice Taney said that black people had no rights which a white man was bound to respect, and that they may have all the rights and privileges of a citizen of a state, but were not entitled to the rights and privileges of a citizen in any other state. The second main point Chief Justice Taney argues is that Scott had no stand-in to bring the case. Fort Snelling was not actually free territory because the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional. Therefore, Congress did not have the right to bar slavery in any federal territories, depriving slave owners of their slaves. He said violated the Fifth Amendment, that no one could be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of the law, and slaves, therefore, were the property of their owners. So based on his second point, it also, and this is important to note, the Supreme Court ruled that the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional. And obviously, undoubtedly, the Dred Scott decision is going to galvanize and further divide the North and the South. All right, so that's a wrap for me. Adam Doris has another great video on Dred Scott that I posted a link to, worth checking out. I will see you guys in school on Monday.